All right, it's recording now. So I will post these on Brightspace just in case you miss a class or you want to review. Sometimes people say, can I have your PowerPoints, all that kind of stuff. I like to just record it, and then you can go through and listen to it at your own speed. If you have insomnia, it's very good for that as well, because it tends to cure insomnia. I think it's something about, the melodious nature of my voice. It tends to put people to sleep in class, and so why wouldn't it work outside of class as well? And it does, evidently. So, let's just say a few preliminary things about church history in general, and then we'll say a few things specific as we get started. If I can load this thing up, let me go over here. This is my pointer. There we go. Okay. So, history of the early church. As I said, this course is going to cover from the beginning. So we'll say it's the birth of Christ. Okay. Certainly the church didn't exist prior to Christ. So we won't debate that point. So that's, most people say, about 4 BC, 6 BC. Okay. Up to into the 4th century, so let's say around 350, maybe a little bit past that. Okay, so we're talking about 350 years of history, roughly, is what we're going to be focusing on. So today, I just want us to think a little bit about church history. Why should we study it? So this is my polemic, my apology, if you will, to use the Greek style of defense of church history. One of the questions I used to ask people, I guess I'm going to ask you today, is, think about how did we get here today? I don't mean in this room, but I mean the church. How did we get here? You go back, let's say Acts 2. If you want to say that's when the church began, Acts 2. Okay, that's a good place to put it. Acts 2, there was just one group of people, right, in Jerusalem, and the church began on that day. Peter preached a message, right, and the church began. Now, if you look at it today, it's a lot more complicated. We got a lot of groups out there. We got all kinds of groups. I used to say the yellow pages. Well, I guess I need to change this. Nobody even knows what the yellow pages are anymore, right? So, I guess if you Google, if you go to Google and you Google churches in Lakeland or something like that, right? I don't know how many you would get. You could try it, but I bet there would be, I don't know if there would be hundreds, but there would be scores of churches, right? You'd have all kinds of churches. You would have Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Assembly of God, Episcopalians, Roman Catholics. The list goes on and on, right? And then we're not even talking about the different permutations of those, There's probably 100 different kinds of Baptist groups, just if you wanted to focus on it. There's scores of them anyway, all right? Hard Shell Baptist, Free Will Baptist, Southern Baptist, American Baptist, and so forth. So just think about that. We have scores and scores of different groups that are churches. They agree about some things, other things they don't agree about. Now, we're not going to be able to cover all that in this course, but I just want you to think that way. How did we get here? We want to go back to the very earliest parts, but I thought what I would do is just give you some rationale for church history in your personal life. Certainly if you're going into ministry, or I would assume that even if you're not going to be in a paid ministry, that you'll be, I hope, working with a church, a congregation, right? So one of the things that studying church history does is it gives us examples of the past, right? That's a basic thing about all history, I suppose, is that it gives, the idea that history repeats itself, I think, is a good one. And maybe not identically, but we can see a lot of things that get repeated. So sometimes I think we approach problems of today, whether they're in the church or not, as though it's the first time they've ever happened, as though nobody has ever faced this before. Let's take the church, for example. One of the big issues, at least was a big issue for a while, I guess maybe it still is in some places, is church music, right? Church worship. How should that happen? And you might think, well, this is the only time that's just for the lads. No, that's been going on pretty much since the beginning, right? So, or leadership of the church, who should lead, how it should be. Probably people are sinful. How does the church deal with sinful members or sinful people that do things that are wrong? I mean, I remember when I was a kid and I was going to church, I used to think, man, it would be great if you lived in the New Testament period. That's what I thought. It'd be really great to live in the New Testament period. Because I thought, if you had a problem, if you didn't understand something, there's Paul right there. You say, Paul, can you help me out? John, the Apostle John, you're here. What did you mean when you wrote this? What does this mean? How do we do this? I thought, man, that would solve our problems. All these people arguing about stuff. If we just would talk to Paul or John, if we could talk to these leaders of the church. But then, of course, when you really study the New Testament, you see the people had Paul right there, they had John there, they had Peter there, and they're still fighting, right? It didn't solve that issue. People are contentious. People fight. People argue. That's just the way they are. If you get a group of people together, you're probably going to have eventually there's going to be some tension, some dispute. But we can look and see examples from the past that can help guide us today. That can help us understand sort of the bigger picture. So I like to think of history as much like memory, right? Our collective memory is history. And when we don't study history, we don't pay any attention to it, it's as though we have amnesia. Or maybe Alzheimer's, right? I don't know if you know anybody with that. It's a terrible disease. But that's when you don't even remember things that you... What's that?
My grandpa died from that.
Yes. You don't remember things that you ought to remember, right? Like even your own children or your own family or other things. I mean, it's terrible. But a lot of times we sort of bring that kind of situation on ourselves. They used to have movies, old television shows. The guy would get hit in the head, and he didn't know who he was, and maybe towards the end of the show, something would happen. Maybe he gets hit in the head again. Now he remembers everything, right? So it helps us that way. So modern conflicts over culture and compromise, worship, those sorts of things. This is one of the things today, we try to be extremely relevant to our culture, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but then if we get extremely relevant, what... Okay. What separates us from the world? We're to be in the world but not of the world, right? So we want to really be able to reach the world, so we approach it that way. So how far is too far? Again, I'm not going to answer any of these questions. I'm just bringing them up. But church history helps us at least understand that cultural conflicts and these kinds of discussions have been going on for hundreds of years. Conflict is nothing new. And so I think church history can help us to come to understand these things. It's our collective memory. And for the church, church history becomes our collective memory. Okay? All right. Let me move on. I have, without it, we have amnesia. Okay. We've said all that. So let's move on. I think other things that church history can help us with can help us avoid heresies or false teaching, false doctrine. Why? Well, we can look and see, there have been a lot of different views set forth in the past You can study those views. Now, sometimes, some people say, well, why would you want to study, like early heresies of the church or something? Well, by studying these things, I think it helps us clarify what we do believe. If you never think about what you believe, if you just sort of say, well, I think we just all kind of accept this, right, don't we? And it's there, it's in the Bible or whatever, so everybody believes it. It helps focus you. It gives us a sense of perspective. And you know what? There's a lot of heroes in the past. You don't have to just look to today. There are many heroes in the past that we can be inspired by. Now, people who gave up their lives for their beliefs and for the church. People who stood and testified when it was not an easy thing to do. Okay? Martin Luther is a good example, certainly. Yeah.
His reputation was almost destroyed.
Here I stand. Yeah, well, his life was almost lost, too. Well, anyway, helps us clarify doctrines, sense of perspective, gives us hearing, so on. Provides, if nothing else, anybody who's a teacher or a preacher, if you just want to be very practical about this ministry, you can use church history for a lot of illustrations, right? A lot of stories, a lot of things to illustrate points you're trying to make. You can say, well, you know what? Augustine, other people did these kinds of things. So there you go. All right. Helps of church history. Reasons we ought to study it, things that might help us. I think the next couple of screens, I kind of do like a really fast overview of church history. Just like in 3 screens. Just to, sometimes we don't do that. We say, well, that's too superficial. But I think it helps us to see it. So let's just do it. Ancient or early church history. Some people call this ancient church history. I tend to call it early church history. So what are we saying? Well, this one's got like 5 to 590. We're not going to get up to 590. But some people would break it down that way. And we could put it into 3 big periods. Let me just put them up there. The first one is the beginnings and the spread of Christianity, right? You could date it back to the birth of Christ. You could date it back to the ministry of Christ, right? His followers, his first followers. And certainly you could date it back to after his burial and resurrection. So most people will place that around 33 AD, roughly, okay? Jesus lives to be about 30 years old. So somewhere around 30 AD. And then shortly thereafter is the day of Pentecost and the church begins. So let's say from that time up to 100. Let's take it up to through the first century. This is sort of the first generation of the church. So what that means is we still have some apostles around up to that point, right? The longest lived apostle is John. John lives up to about 100 AD, let's just say roughly. He was the youngest, most people believe he was the youngest of the disciples. Very close to Jesus, as you know. You remember on the cross what Jesus said, "Behold your mother, behold your son." Jesus was the eldest son. It was up to him to take care of his mother. And he basically assigned that to John. John, he's saying, John, please help my mother. Look after her. I'm not going to be here to do it. And he's saying to Mary, John is going to be the one that helps you. So that Mary and John are tied together, right? And John ends up in Asia Minor. Most people believe Mary ends up in Asia Minor, depending on who you're talking to. In the Roman Catholic tradition, they believe she never died and she ascended into heaven from Ephesus. Okay? So you can go to the House of Mary. I've been to the House of Mary at Ephesus. But it's interesting, the house of Mary at Ephesus was not discovered until like 1890, when a nun in Germany had a vision and said, there's a house of Mary, the house where Mary lived is there, and then she directed people from this vision. They dug and they found, a building, and so they say that's where she lived. Is that true or not? Well, I'll leave that for you to think about. But that's how that house. And now, of course, people love to go there, especially Roman Catholics love to go there because it's tied to Mary, and it's away from the rest of the ruins of Ephesus, and it's up on a hillside. There's a lot of trees there. It's a beautiful location. And there's a spring, so people gather the water, take it with them, they drink it, take it with them, it's holy water, because it's connected with Mary. So, the spread of Christianity, starting around 33 to 100. Then, what happens? We have lots of persecution and trouble with heresies. And that's from 100 to 313. And then we have the triumph of Christianity with the coming of Constantine. Well, I see people peeking in the door. I think we're out of time for now. So I will post this and we will continue on